Chapter 3. When the men were 2 minutes gone, I returned my attention to the warning in my mind window. In 20 minutes, I'd start losing health at an alarming pace, and if I didn't start thinking like my father's daughter, my corpse wouldn't be found until the thaw, if the wolves left anything to find. I trudged deeper into the thicket in case more riders appeared. It wouldn't do to make fire out in the open just to have people stumble upon me because of the smoke or bright flames. With the rake handle grasped in both hands, I dropped to my knees and shoved snow forward until I spied frozen pine straw beneath. Although my knees didn't want to cooperate, I raised them and stomped down the remaining snow. Then I shuffled forward to cut a channel for air to get to the fire. The thicket boasted trees of all kinds, pines, oaks, willows, and the like, but finding dry wood in the mess might prove daunting. A fallen trunk with piled snow atop it lingered nearby, but with no axe at hand, it do me little good. So I walked around shaking snow off branches, snapped them off, then checked the ends for dry wood. Any who made the grade ended up in my snow pit. Retrieving my father's knife, I stripped bark from a thicker branch, then set to work cutting the wood beneath. Layer upon layer proved wet, but I eventually cut to the welcome sight of drier flesh. I'd once repaired a pocket in my coat with a needle and thread, and now I took my knife to it and undid my work. When I arranged 3 sticks to form a triangle, I set the pocket inside, then cut shavings into it. A gust of wind blew right up the channel, so I slapped my hand down to keep the pocket in place. I spotted some paper-like bark peeling away from a nearby tree, so I brushed the smatterings of snow away and set it atop the branch pile. Then, the hard part. I found a piece of wood in which I could cut a slim channel for a fireboard, but no matter how I searched, I couldn't find a sturdy stick whose end was dry enough to create heat when I applied friction. I scrambled around, knowing time was my enemy. Then it occurred to me to look skyward. 2 feet overhead, a few sticks balanced on the branches of an old oak. One was long and straight. Since they'd never touched the ground, I knew they'd be drier inside, but I couldn't reach them. My rake handle, or what my mind window called a staff, was perfect. I poked the sticks free, and even managed to catch 2 of them before they could reach the ground, despite my freezing hands. When I'd carried them back to the channel, I set them atop the sticks I'd already collected. The bark's grasp on the underside of the wood was loose, so I chipped it away by hand. Even though the first layer showed some moisture, shaving it down with my knife proved fruitful when I struck dry wood. I added it to the shaving in the pocket, then chopped away to create a narrower, flat end. Every fool in Rubal knew the secret to survival was to keep your HP recovery rate up. To do that, I needed to get warm. But to do that, I had to get that fire started. Setting the fireboard under my boots, I set the tip of the spindle I'd carved into the channel. But when I tried to twist it in the palms of my hands, it dropped to the ground. I snatched it up, but my trembling hands still wouldn't cooperate. I cupped them to my mouth, blew into them, then rubbed them together for a minute. They were anything but warm when I finished, but I managed to maintain a grasp. The wood spun downward through the channel, then I reset it at the top and repeated. Over and over again for what was only minutes but seemed like hours in the frigid cold. The wood spun in the channel as the thick plumes of steam from my heavy breathing streamed from my lips. Your stamina has dropped to 30%, 53 of 176. The last thing I needed was to reach 0 and pass out. I suppressed the urge to dishonor the goddess by uttering the foul words running through my mind. To calm myself, I drew a long breath that dried my throat with cold, held it for a moment, then relaxed my chest muscles and let the vapor escape on its own. I repeated my breathing, then my stamina started to tick up. Stamina, 41%, 72 of 176. A burst of activity later, it dropped again, but I pushed through until a tiny stream of smoke rose from the wood. I bent and spied a tiny orange ember. For good measure, I ran the spindle through the channel again, dropped it, then grabbed the knife with designs on using the tip to scoop up the ember. But my hands shook so violently I had to blow more air through them, then breathe deeply until my stamina reached 50%. By then, the ember was gone. This time, I let a flurry of curse words fly through my lips. Within a few minutes, the spindle had done its work again. This time, I drew every bit of determination I had left, scooped up the ember, then dropped it into the pocket with the shavings. I cut my hands around it and blew into the pocket. A glorious stream of smoke rose. You have unlocked the survival skill. Your survival skill has reached rank 2. even though it was lost on me how I had no survival skill when I'd spent my life making fires like this just for fun and to impress my father. This was the least of my worries. Maybe the survival skill required more abilities than building fires or creating basic shelters. I blew and blew, the smoke thickened, the papery bark cracked in my hands. I set it atop the burning pocket before the fire could peter out. When the pocket burst into flames, I blew with desperation until the bark ignited. Your survival skill has reached rank 3. Glorious. In minutes, the flames licked at the bark, bringing the unfortunate reminder of the fire coursing up the doorframe in our house when the demons brought their evil magic to bear. I added shavings, then the driest of branches I'd cracked from the surrounding trunks. I blew and blew. The flames climbed. Before long, my hands hovered over the tiny fire. They itched and tingled, sending new shivers up and down my arms. Your survival skill has reached rank 4. I whispered with the wind. I just got so lucky. When my hands were warm, I slipped off my boots, set my feet atop them, and warmed my heels. When the flames receded, I added the slightly wetter sticks. Then, for good measure, I shaved more wood and dropped it on top. Then the tears came. And although I was sure my father wouldn't have approved of the moment of weakness in my current state, I did little to suppress them. But after a few minutes, I swept them from my thawing cheeks and forced deep, cold breaths into my lungs. I turned my attention to the next step. I'd spent the morning running, trying to get through each moment. Now that I had fire, I'd need energy. That meant food. I wasn't going to get far trying to hunt with a knife and a rake handle, and I could forget about trying to fashion a bow fast enough. So I needed to find a settlement or some form of civilization. My father's voice echoed again.
Trust no one.
Yeah, well, would you rather I died? My mind window had a map tab. I opened it, scanned the topography. It was mostly just a gray sheet, except for the area I'd traversed since leaving the farm. It seemed to reveal lands to me as I crossed them. Strange. But in the east, I spied a little red flag among the ocean of gray. When I focused on it, words popped up next to an arrow pointing at it. Point of interest. That's it? A fierce wind blew, then snow rained down in clumps around me. I glanced up in time to see a huge one teeter off a low branch. I bent forward as the breath caught in my chest, but I was too late. The snow covered my fire with a splat. Gah! I screamed. I kicked snow off one foot, shoved my feet into my boots, then stood, fists set to my hips. I glared at the clump of snow with fierce intentions. I kicked it, slipped, then tumbled to my death. You have fallen. -1 HP. 161 HP remaining. I shuffled to my feet, then eyed my map while I rubbed the chilly soreness out of my behind. The red flag stood out, and although I didn't understand the design Solara had on me after a morning like the one I'd experienced, it seemed like a sign. Giving the wet pile of wood a final, more careful kick, I grabbed my rake handle, sheathed the knife, then set off. As I left the fire site, I swung the stick at a tree out of frustration. Snow rained down on my head, because of course it did. Your staff skill has reached rank 4. By the goddess, I couldn't have cared less. I trudged through the woods with my hands stuffed in my pants and the rake handle grasped by my armpit. The cold seeped into my toes again within minutes, and soon my mind window warned me of what it called hypothermia again, whatever that was. I gauged my progress by watching the translucent map I'd somehow arranged in one corner of my mind window. It'd only taken a thought. Just like when I arranged things in little panels for comparison back home. Soon, I wondered if the flag was actually moving away from me. The world teetered every once in a while, and I stopped each time to regain my senses. When I set the back of my hand to my forehead, I was shocked to find it burning with fever. This was bad. I needed to rest, but stopping then would have spelled my end. I'd long left the thicket of trees behind, and being in the open was bad enough. But if I didn't get to that flag, assuming it wasn't just a frozen waterfall or something of the like, my life was over. I trudged for another hour, then received another warning. You have 10 minutes before hypothermia consumes you. Tremors of fear radiated through me, and as I raised a foot high to stomp forward, the edges of my vision turned gray. Little white motes danced before my eyes. I set my foot down, waited. When my vision returned to normal, I trudged forward, but somewhere in the back of my consciousness, I knew my trek was over. When a final message warning of me in my deteriorating state appeared in my mind window, I fell flat on my back and stared into the gray sky. My legs quivered beyond my control. A snowflake landed on the tip of my nose. The flag on the map was an inch away from where I'd fallen, but my legs no longer served my purposes. There, many miles from the place I'd called home for all of my 17 years, I would die. In my final moments, I turned my mind to Solara and imagined a place in the sky where it glowed every day with golden warmth, the place I hoped to see Baba again. My eyelids fluttered shut. Chapter 4. 4 years earlier. Baba stopped and sat on the log of a fallen creeping oak between two twisted branches. When he reached for his bow, I grasped the reason for his stopping. Something was on his mind. He reinforced my suspicion when he set the tip of his bow between his boots, twisted it into the ground, then bent the shaft to give the string some slack. One corner of my mouth curved toward my cheek, and my father took that moment to raise his contemplative gaze toward me.
What? Feeling a little impatient?
I let my facial muscles go slack. Since my days as a wee bit, he'd been consistent about pointing out that little character flaw. Where Baba pursued a calm disposition regardless of a given situation, I maintained what he called singular focus. I didn't care for the description. His tone often didn't reveal whether I was being criticized or complimented. Not at all, Baba. I scanned the trunk and found a place where my backside would fit between the jutting, twisted spokes of wood, hoping the diversion would shroud my lie. When I plopped down, he flashed me a rare smile. By Solara's light. It was a challenge to have such an intuitive parent, but if he taught me anything in my first 13 years, it'd been to stick with the plan once I was committed. So I would. I set my own bow between my feet, glanced along its bend, then plucked the string. The vibration reverberated, so I felt it in the wood. No tightening needed, so I peered skyward at the web of branches overhead. Rays of light peeked through to cast golden spots on the bark of a great pine.
You're bothered because the elk is on the run and I've stopped to adjust my bow.
I shook my head again, sticking with the plan. Nope, just enjoying the cool air. In fact, it was damned frigid, but I wouldn't let him know it. Thick skin was important. Toughness.
You want to build a fire?
My head whipped around. Build a fire? We're hunting. That's ridiculous. A wide grin spread across his face, and I realized I'd stumbled onto his gambit entirely too late. Damn it. He'd played me like a master lutist, revealed my restlessness in just 5 words. Why did we stop, Baba? He reached behind his back, then reached toward me over a crooked branch, revealing an implement in his grasp. I snatched it. Where'd you get this? A pristine leather sheath stretched 5 inches long, a bit more maybe. A handle of white shining stone with grains of deep gray reflected the light peeking through the trees, washing it in a mystic glow.
Millbury Peaks during my last trade run.
You went all the way to the city? I'd wondered why you were gone so long. He nodded.
More of a town, but yes.
Well, it's beautiful. I clutched the handle, then tugged just hard enough to get it to click free of the sheath. The metal on leather whisper was like music. The silvery edge was so sharp, it would cut through tree branches, and a solid thickness on the backside of the blade meant it could take a beating if I needed to use it for said purpose. I sheathed it, the hunt forgotten, then offered it back to him. Baba shook his head.
It's yours, little girl.
I might have started a lecture on the little girl thing, but in light of the shivers of excitement radiating through my fingertips, I couldn't have cared less. Baba, this would cost too much. I met his gaze. Wouldn't it?
I guess you'll never know.
He reached over the branch again and patted my knee.
You've become skilled with a blade, Tess, and it's time to leave the old behind in favor of the new.
I got the distinct impression he was talking about something else entirely. But if he was, the lesson would unwind at his chosen pace, so I nodded rather than show an ounce of impatience.
I'll need the old one.
My hand slapped the tattered, aged sheath on my left hip. Baba shook his head.
Sorry, those are the rules. You can have the new one, but you have to be willing to part with that which has lost its usefulness.
But it hasn't lost anything. It cuts fine.
Tess, you've sharpened that blade 1,000 times. It's nicked and worn. I'd have you better prepared in case you ever find yourself alone.
My heart palpitated. Alone? Why would I be alone? He chuckled.
Do you think you're going to be on this farm forever? That I'll live to be 1,000?
I pushed out my bottom lip, realized it, then sucked it so hard it disappeared inside my mouth. I'd hoped so. He tugged at the bowstring when he replied, wrapping it tightly around one tip.
It doesn't work that way, Tess. No one lives forever, and someday you'll have to make your own way. If we camped by a fire every night and I told you every story I knew, it still wouldn't prepare you. It's a vast world out there, and so few have seen much of it. It's a wonderful mystery, but also a potentially dangerous one. Do you understand?
I nodded, slid the old sheath off my belt, gripped its handle a final time, then presented it. My father snatched it, threw it over his shoulder onto the ground, then stood. I followed its arc and spied the bush under which it rolled, but Baba plucked his tightened bowstring and drew my focus.
Don't come back for it, Tess. It's in your past, and it's best to leave the past behind. Learn your mistakes and use them to plot a way forward.
He gripped my shoulders and kissed my forehead. The stiff whiskers protruding from his top lip bit at my flesh, but they brought the welcome familiarity of his love. I'd have that the rest of my life, whether he was still there or not.
I guess we should get going before it gets away.
I shook my head. Nah, my arrow got it in the hip. It won't go far. Baba stepped onto the trunk, then hopped off the other side. I spoke to his back instead of following. Baba?
Yeah?
I thrust a finger toward the southwest. It went that way. He scanned the area.
How do you figure?
I strolled to the opposite end of the tree, reached down, then snapped off a dangling piece of branch connected to a thicker one. When I tapped it with 2 fingers, then raised them for Baba to see, he'd spied the blood I'd noticed.
You're becoming quite the tracker, daughter.
I had a good teacher. Baba smiled.